Okay, this video is going to get personal. This is not a topic that I had intended to cover in the near term, but something happened that I believe is well worth addressing. Today, we are going to talk about Mr. Beast. Or more accurately, we are going to talk about the gender transition of Chris Tyson, the Mr. Beast sidekick. Now, you're forgiven if you have no idea who Mr. Beast is. I certainly wouldn't either if it wasn't for my partner's 7-year-old sister, who is obsessed with his YouTube antics. Basically, there's this YouTuber named Mr. Beast. Actually, his name is Jimmy Donaldson, but Mr. Beast is his affirmed name. I honestly haven't seen much of his videos, but from what I've seen, he's a genuine and kind human. Many of his videos hold philanthropic themes, and he's most known for giving away tons of money as part of bombastic YouTube stunts. He uncoincidentally happens to be the most subscribed to YouTuber. Anyway, Mr. Beast has this childhood friend, Chris Tyson, who frequently appears in his videos. In the summer of 2022, Tyson and his wife Katie separated, and now Chris announced that they have started hormone reassignment therapy. So that's what we know, and that is all that we know. But of course, this week people have been flipping out over what this means for Chris, whether or not this is the reason why him and his wife separated, and of course, whether or not this will have a negative effect on Mr. Beast's platform, which Mr. Beast says he's not even concerned about. Now, normally I would care very little about this sort of thing, except that some of the discourse has got me thinking. Here's a particular tweet that caught my attention. I should note up front that I have no idea what inflection the individual meant when they wrote this tweet, so I'm gonna make it up myself. I don't know who needs to hear this, but if you turn around, get married, have kids, and then suddenly come out as trans and insist your children call you mommy and that your wife is now a lesbian, you're a shit person. Why should anyone celebrate the fact that you're a liar who married your wife under false pretenses and wasted her youth? In all other instances, when men or women lie to their spouses about something so major and ruin the marriage, people give support to the spouse who was lied to. But in this one instance, the spouse is expected to celebrate. Why? The situation with Chris from Mr. Beast is gross. It's gross. I'm not going to talk much about Chris because we don't have any real info about the transition. The post I just read characterizes suddenly coming out as trans. Maybe that is what happened with Chris Tyson's case. Maybe not. I have no idea. But the post I read might as well have been about me. See, I was 28 years old when my wife and I separated, and this occurred just before my own gender transition. So let's use me as a case study instead. I think it's really easy to forget that when the current wave of adult transitioners were kids and teenagers, transition was about as marginalized as it could possibly get. For those of you who were alive in the 90s, you likely remember that man-up culture that we subjected towards our boys. I know it actually originates long before the 90s, but I wasn't alive then. There were lots of problems with this regressive way of treating boys to be men, and one inevitable consequence of teaching your son that dignity and pride is bestowed for being a man is the implication that anything feminine is the opposite of dignified. And those are the things that I've always been drawn towards. As long as I can remember, and I'm talking very young, I had understood that I was male and that there were certain activities, behaviors, preferences, and interests that I should not partake within. And these were completely misaligned with my natural tendencies. When I went to the store to buy shoes with my parents, I would walk into the aisle and instantly be attracted to the pink and white pair that matched what Alisha and Jenna were wearing at school. But I also knew that they were girls' shoes and that there was something wrong with me for even the wish to wear shoes like that. So I would never tell my parents this. After a quick glance, I would avoid even looking at them while I walked down the aisle and went to the boys section where my mom and dad would be waiting and have selected a mundane pair and asked if I liked them. I would just say yes, because it was the answer that got us out of the aisle the fastest. And after all, the shoes they picked were fine, right? They functioned. They kept my feet dry. I did this with everything. I learned to repress and I hid what I couldn't. And the consequence of this is I never learned the basis of authenticity, of expressing what I wanted, or even honoring the concept of liking something at all. I was too young to understand the concept of being transgender yet, but the repression was already happening. And along with this came intense amounts of shame. Throughout my teens and 20s, I was plagued with 2 mental health issues. The first was the gender dysphoria I knew I had, but the second was the baggage of intense shame I internalized by not dealing with the dysphoria from childhood. That second one is such an important part and has huge implications on how my teenage years and adulthood played out. I think it's easy for us to ignore the latter and focus only on the dysphoria. When I was 14 years old, before even meeting my future wife, I made the decision that I was not going to transition. I knew I was beyond the age where puberty blockers would have prevented the masculinization of aspects of my body such as height, bone density, and my voice lowering, so my chances of passing as female were slim. Nothing in the realm of hormones and surgeries were financially subsidized, and I knew just how huge of an expense it would be throughout my late teens and 20s to transition. There were no protections for transgender individuals in Canada or anywhere else in the early 2000s, so I had no protection to ensure that I wasn't discriminated against in jobs, housing, and other aspects of life. But beyond all of this, the biggest deterrent of them all, I would have to face telling my Christian parents how I felt about my gender. I knew that they would never support me in pursuing a transition, and I knew that even telling them this would both devastate them and humiliate me. Gender positioning was so rigid back then, and in many ways still is today. Even as a child, I had deeply internalized that there was something horribly shameful about a man expressing any feminine tendencies. So, at 14, I resolved I was not going to transition. I would bury these feelings and just learn to be a man. But what I didn't realize at the time was that my decision not to transition was coupled with a resolve to disavow happiness and fulfillment in my life. See, I knew clearly what I wanted, and I was actively choosing against it. I wasn't dealing with any of these feelings, I was just repressing them. I had told myself that it was better for me, my parents, my siblings, and my future wife if I didn't transition, didn't express these feelings, and just learned to fake the masculine behavior and roles that I was supposed to embody. I consciously chose to stop chasing love, happiness, and fulfillment, and instead pursued what would make me look good, and strong, and powerful, and manly. And none of it worked. Have I mentioned that I made a truly awful husband? I told my girlfriend and future wife how I felt about my sex when we were 18 years old. We had been dating for 2 years at that time. I told her that I had no intention of transitioning, which I didn't, and we then jointly ignored my identity issues for the following 10 years. We would awkwardly discuss it every few months. She would sometimes bring it up and ask if I still felt dysphoric. I would passively tell her that I did, remind her that this was always on my mind and deeply shaped how I perceived of myself and my reality. We would then drop the topic for another few months. Aside from a few counselors, therapists, and one single friend I told when I was 23, I discussed this with nobody else. Now, to tie this back to where we started, I think it's a little unfair to make comments about someone who transitions in adulthood as though they are transitioning only out of a selfish endeavor or accusing people of getting married under false pretenses. There's a lot going on here, and the regressive way we've handled masculinity, femininity, and transgender matters for the past 100+ years has absolutely had an effect on the way the lives of individuals like me have materialized. But I also think the commenter has an important point. My wife sought a husband who would love and cherish her, and I made an oath to my wife when I got married, and I didn't keep it. That's not something to just gloss over and act like it doesn't matter. Now, I should make it clear that my wife did not separate with me because of my transition. In fact, it was 3 months after she had moved out that I decided I was going to start pursuing the process of transitioning. But as I've already discussed, my eventual transition came after I built a life for myself and entered into a marriage that I couldn't make work. Our divorce came after years of me not delivering on the very reasonable expectations that she held towards me as her husband. And it was my unmanaged dysphoria and shame that at 28 years old caused my mental health and facade to collapse to the point that it took my marriage down along with it. I hold responsibility here. I could have done better. And I willingly entered into a relationship context that I couldn't keep. My ex-wife and I didn't have any children together, but I can absolutely appreciate that when children are brought into the mix, these situations are even more complicated. And I do think it's a problem when we act like someone's coming out should be something to be unconditionally celebrated and everyone in their life should just be able to deal with it and move on. It's not that simple, and there's a loss for others beyond the transitioning individual. It's heartbreaking. The takeaway I hope we can all get behind is that this is exactly why we need to do a better job with how we handle gender dysphoria. This is why we need to do a better job creating spaces where children are able to be themselves. And this is why we need to prioritize mental health. My transition is linked with a lot of pain for myself, my ex-wife, my family, and friends. And when I say my transition is linked, I don't just mean the act of transitioning, because many of the most painful moments actually occurred as fallout before my transition even began. There's so much more I would like to say about how I think we can handle these things better, but I'm not going to get into them here because this short has become not so short. If you're interested in following future videos on this topic, then follow me on Twitter or YouTube to get ongoing video updates. One more thing I forgot to mention, why can't we just leave Chris alone? What Chris wants to make public, Chris will make public. What Katie wants to make public, she will make public. And we don't need to speculate on what's going on with their relationship. That's disrespectful and helps nobody.